What's up, everybody? Today is episode 103 of the Q&A. So, as always, if you enjoy the Q&A, please remember to like the video on YouTube when it is released on YouTube. If you'd like to become a more substantial supporter of the Q&A, I'll put a link to Patreon here, and you can join that for $1 a month. If you would like to check out my ebooks, there is a link in my bio or in the description box on YouTube. And if you'd like to work with me for one-on-one coaching, just DM me on Instagram or look for my email in the description box on YouTube. With that said, let's get to the first question of the day. All else equal, what are the implications of doing a high amount of unilateral training? Well, it's got a poor SFR because you are getting a slightly better stimulus when you do one limb at a time. You get better motor unit recruitment that way. However, it costs you the same amount of central fatigue as if you did a set bilaterally. So you are literally doubling the amount of central fatigue in order to get ever so slightly better stimulus to a single limb. So in most cases, it's not worth it. If you're referencing my training, obviously I'm doing that because of injury, and as soon as I am healed, I will no longer be doing unilateral training. Do you think other equipment manufacturers will incorporate strength curve equipment like Prime, Atlantis, Panada, etc.? No, I mean, why would they do that? Like Hammer Strength, for example, Life Fitness, they're the leading equipment manufacturers in the entire world. Tons of gyms just buy like their entire line, commercial gyms. So the only people that make specialized equipment are the ones going after niche bodybuilding markets. To what extent does the low T impact building muscle? I mean, this is kind of like asking me, to what extent does height affect dating? Well, if you're within like the first standard deviation, which is like, I don't know, 5'8" to 6 feet tall, it probably really doesn't matter that much. But as soon as we start talking about outliers, like let's say a guy's 5 feet tall or he's 6'4", those can start to matter a lot more, right? And it's the same thing with testosterone. And in exactly the same way that a lot of men complain about height who aren't really all that short, a lot of people who don't actually have low T are talking about how it impacts building muscle. Like I've had people come to me with testosterone levels of like 450 nanograms per deciliter, 500 nanograms per deciliter, and the natural range is like 350 to 1,000 or around there. And I'd be like, should I consider TRT? It's like, motherfucker, you're well within the normal range. Now, all that said, if you take somebody who has a legitimate low test, they are hypogonadal, like by medical definition. Like say somebody has 100 nanograms per deciliter for their testosterone level, and we put them on TRT and bring them up to like 700 to 800, that is going to be a revolution of sorts for them in terms of strength and muscle building. They might gain 10 to 15 pounds of muscle in the first year. But again, there's a lot of natural variation here. My testosterone levels before using steroids were 450 nanograms per deciliter, and I bench pressed 385 at 190. I squatted 573, and I deadlifted over 600 pounds. So a lot of people, it's just making excuses. In the context of a contest prep bodybuilding diet, do you think the FDA allowance for error margin in terms of calories and macros on processed food is enough of a justification to stick to single ingredient foods during prep because they have a more reliable calorie and macro profile? Man, I don't 100% know if that's true, but if it is, yes, and I would stick to single ingredient foods during a prep anyway, because unprocessed foods simply wreak havoc on my digestion, and I would always in the back of my head be wondering, would I have done better if I ate single ingredient foods? Any recommendations for squat wedges? So I personally don't use squat wedges because you can only use them on squats. So I use Olympic lifting shoes with a very tall heel, and then I put Versalifts inside of them to make the heel almost 2 inches. Now that said, Prime, yes, is an option, but they're very expensive. And my buddy Trevor, who I trust on equipment probably more than anybody, says the knockoffs on Amazon are just as good. If powerlifters generally want a more hip-dominant squat, then why should they use squat shoes if squat shoes make things slightly more quad biased? Because that's just not true. Powerlifters do not generally want a more hip-biased squat. If anything, powerlifters want to use as much quad as possible because your body will naturally solve the equation of lifting the weight by pulling your knees back once the quads are maxed out. And if you have a reservoir of quad strength, then you're going to be able to lift a little bit more weight before your knees fully pull all the way back and you have to complete the lift with pure hips. The higher the weight you get to before that happens, the more you lift. If you are a lifter that has gotten good results with low volume, when, if ever, should you consider increasing volume? I honestly feel like I answer some variation of these volume questions every single Q&A, and it kind of baffles me because I'm so consistent with my messaging. There's nothing magical about volume. Okay, we manipulate volume, frequency, and intensity to produce progress. So when do you manipulate volume or any other variable? When your progress has become stagnant and you need to get unstuck. Can your body adapt to doing more volume, and would that lead to more progress over time? So the reality of the situation is that in order to vastly increase your volume tolerance, you would have to do pretty large amounts of cardio. And in so doing, you would create an interference effect that was large enough that it would actually be a net negative. So by the time that you got in good enough shape to handle a significantly more volume than you're currently doing by doing cardio training, that cardio training would have such a large negative effect that the whole endeavor was pointless. So what you're talking about is what the case tends to be for most people, and that is, throughout your training career, your ability to tolerate workload does increase. However, so does your ability to impart a stimulus. And what tends to happen is that somewhere in the early to mid-intermediate stage, your ability to impart stimulus keeps increasing, whereas your ability to tolerate more and more volume starts increasing at a lower and lower rate. And you eventually get to the point where you become so strong that you can recover from less than you used to be able to recover from. What tends to happen is that your volume will peak in the intermediate phase. When you're a novice, you simply don't need that much because a very small amount goes a long way, and doing more just makes you even more sore and burns you out. But as you become an intermediate, you need to start finding and operating closer to your, max adaptive volumes. And what's going to happen is that those volume levels are going to significantly decrease as you go from a 405 to a 600 pound deadlift. So it's not that you are operating further away from your max volumes as you've gotten stronger. It's just that those volumes have decreased because you've gotten stronger. The only exception to all of this is if you are under training. If you're under training what you can recover from, by increasing the volume, you will make faster progress. Are there any exercises to thicken the arms from the front? Curls. Curls thicken the arms from the front. And that's it, man. Curls. You don't have big enough arms. You're not strong enough on curls. That really is the bottom line. Yes, you can do things like curls in internal rotation, which will train the short head of the bicep, which is going to provide a little bit more of a width appearance. But here's the thing. Beginners and early intermediates don't need to worry about biasing the short or the long head of the bicep because you're so far away from max adaptation that all curls train both heads hard. How important do you think hinges are in a hypertrophy program? I mean, it's literally one of the top 4 most important movement patterns. You have press, pull, squat, hinge. Those are the 4 most important foundational movement patterns for all of strength and hypertrophy training. Like you could potentially try to piece everything together and do leg curls for hamstrings, but that's not going to train the hip extension function of the hamstrings. You could try to do hip thrusts for glutes, but that's not going to train the glutes in a lengthened position. I mean, what are you going to do for erectors? Just bent over rows? I mean, hinges are the primary ways to get huge jacked erectors. If you're looking to find a way to get rid of hinges from your program, I mean, you're barking up the wrong tree, man. You're taking away one of the most important and fundamental movement patterns in all of training. Alrighty, folks, that is it for today's Q&A. So as always, if you enjoyed the Q&As, please like the Q&A when it comes out on YouTube. I'll put a link in the next slide, most likely. If you'd like to become a more substantial supporter of the Q&A, there will be a link on the screen to Patreon, where you can become a supporter for $1 a month, and there'll be a description in the link in the description box on YouTube for that as well. If you'd like to work with me one-on-one for coaching, simply DM me on Instagram or email me, which you can find in the description box on YouTube. And for a link to my ebooks, again, click on my bio on Instagram or go to the description box on YouTube. There will be a link for my ebooks. I will be back on Thursday for another full body training session, which I will continue to do until my right arm catches back up to my left arm, really. So enjoy the week here, folks. Have a good one.